Thank you. My name's Anamik Saha, and I work at the University of Leeds. I'm the author, with Dr. Sandra Van Lente, of a report called Rethinking Diversity in Publishing that we published a couple of years ago, which I'm not going to assume you have read, but also I'm not going to just repeat what was in that report. Do look it up. It's online, and it's free for you all to read. Sarah, in her introduction, said that today was about a celebration of diversity. And I am fully on board that. But also, I want to use this little talk to actually start with a provocation. And that is, I want to call for an end to diversity. Or rather, an end to diversity, in scare quotes. And I say this despite the fact that in publishing, it seems to me, certainly from my research and speaking to literally hundreds of people in the industry as part of that research, that everyone's on board diversity. There is in our research, and maybe this was because of in the context of this research interview with me as a person of colour, people were the mostly white respondents were, saying this for my benefit, but no one seemed to be in denial about the absence of racially minoritized groups in the industry. I think this is a reflection of the liberal nature of the publishing industry, who pride themselves on their openness. I think there is also fear of backlash. We know about social media, for all its problems and challenges, has also enabled audiences to talk back to publishers, to the status quo, to a dominant culture in ways that that group has not been spoken back to before. But there was also a strong sense in our interviews that diversity is good for business. That actually publishing more diversely allows publishing houses to reach more diverse audiences. There was a sense as well that diversity often also leads to innovation, greater innovation and originality. But despite all of those things, despite all of those claims, despite the advocacy for diversity, nothing really is changing, certainly in terms of the makeup of the core publishing industry. So I'm talking about the big publishing houses, if you like. So, as I said, myself and Dr. Van Lente conducted research into this topic. And what we wanted to do was focus on the process of publishing authors of colour to see what that revealed about the nature of racial inequalities in publishing. And quite simply, we found that writers of colour were not given the same freedoms. There were fears over their quality, fears over their authenticity, fears that these stories would be considered too niche. Writers of colour are seen as a riskier investment, which is why publishers are not willing to invest in too much of them. For those of you who work in publishing, you know that the commissioning process, the acquisition process, is very much a case of hedging your bets. You know that not every single book you publish is going to be a massive hit, so you publish a repertoire, a range of books, and hoping that one of them even will be a breakaway hit. In that context, you don't put I'm not a gambler, so I don't know what the right metaphor is here, but you don't put all your bets on just, ethnic authors, for want of a better term, because you'll be limiting the probability. That's the idea. The idea is that too many authors of colour would be too much for the audience, which brings us on to the main finding from our research, that publishing industries still sees its core audience as white and middle class. As a result, writers of colour need to be seen as having value to its demographic, and they are packaged accordingly. While this does afford some writers of colour opportunities, and there are some great publishers doing great work with them, it can also lead to whitewashing or exoticization. It also ignores how some writers of colour just want to write for their own communities. White publishers will contend that black writers do not want to be read only by black readers, but the idea of building the core audience within a black community is alien in mainstream publishing. Adjacent to this issue is how publishers and booksellers undervalue minoritized audiences. Rather, they don't see value in the types of books that they think they would need to make for them. At best, audiences who belong to minoritized communities are seen as an added extra onto the core white middle class audience. At worst, they are seen as minor and economically unviable. As I suggested, publishers do not see any cultural value in the types of books that they think they would need to make for those particular audiences. And I stress the word think because they don't actually have an understanding of the needs and desires of those audiences. So publishers, on the one hand, see the moral value in needing to do diversity better. Excuse me, I have a bit of a cold, so this microphone's not helping me be more discreet about my statement. But we are not persuaded that they see the economic value in authors of colour. Otherwise, they would be doing a lot more to work with them, to find them, and to attract diverse audiences. So basically, we found that publishing has created a system of cultural production that harms writers of colour. So I want to go back to my provocation at the beginning of the talk, in the second half of this, in what remains. Firstly, I want to suggest to you that the problem is the language of diversity itself. What I want to suggest is that it is not the problem, the issue is not that diversity and the initiatives that are being mobilised in its name are not working, or that they're not properly resourced, or that they need more effort and drive put into them. But rather, diversity is the problem itself. Diversity often is seen as an added extra, something you add on to an organisation, rather than a radical transformation of it. Diversity allows us to deflect attention from words such as more assertive words, such as racism or racial inequality. And we can extend this to caste inequalities, to ableism, gender inequalities, sexual inequalities. Obviously, I want to acknowledge those workers, those practitioners, those campaigners and activists who are working within this paradigm of diversity, inequality, and inclusion, who are doing and are trying to address those issues from a more radical stance. But I also want to suggest that maybe it's the language itself, the language of diversity, that is a problem, and that lets the industry off the hook. So this is where I get really provocative. I suggest that we replace the benign language of diversity with a more radical language of reparative justice. So we need to replace diversity with the notion of reparative justice. Just to clarify, reparations with an S means compensation, economic compensation. Also maybe often the giving back of land that was once dispossessed, during often in relation to colonialism and slavery. Reparation without an S means repair. And it's that notion of reparation as repair that my notion of reparative justice builds upon. So it builds on the idea of reparation as repair for the damage caused by slavery and colonialism, including forms of symbolic violence, the legacies of which continue to shape and mar the experiences of racialized people who originated from those regions affected by this history. So reparation, in that sense, starts the process of the realization of how the present and the modern world itself is shaped by the legacies of empire, including slavery and colonialism. And it feels very apt that I'm saying this in the context of the Nehru Centre. So the idea of reparative justice enables us to have a more open conversation about racial inequality in industries like publishing, and how this is part of a long history that goes back to colonialism. Breaking free from this history means owning up to and working through that history, as all of our therapists tell us in our own personal circumstances. So in a more practical sense, what does reparative justice entail in the context of publishing? So I'm going to start off with probably the most controversial measure, and that is, I think we need to replace soft, ineffectual forms of positive action in recruitment, like, that job spec that says we encourage people from, disadvantaged backgrounds, from minoritized backgrounds to apply. Please do. We need to replace that with a more radical policy of affirmative action. Seems like a stretch. If that seems like a stretch, the publishing industry in the UK, certainly in contemporary times, has in fact benefited from a form of affirmative action. Affirmative action, according to equality laws right now, is illegal, but there are several loopholes, including internships for people belonging to communities that evidence shows are not present in a particular sector. A huge number of black, brown and Asian people working in British publishing right now have all come through an organisation that many of you have heard of called Creative Access, who basically have taken advantage of this loophole and are using affirmative action to effectively insert people who have historically been excluded from these industries. Research shows actually that affirmative action works in terms of increasing participation from communities that have been, as I say, historically excluded. I admit that this is a controversial measure, but at the very least, a conversation about affirmative action, and I'm very eager to hear your thoughts on this, allows us to really challenge the idea that publishing is a meritocracy. In fact, it exposes how whiteness is a credential, a positive credential in publishing. Secondly, another practical aspect of a reparative justice program, reparative. I say it in various ways during this talk. You pick the one that you prefer. The second version of a reparative, that's the third way, of justice that I think can apply to publishing is how it leads to organisational transformation inside the core publishing industry. I can't stress this enough. More people of colour inside the industry is not enough. As I said, the process of cultural production, as it is, still harms people from minoritized backgrounds. But more people from those communities inside the industry will at the very least open up a challenge to assumptions about, for instance, black and Asian audiences. If we instill an idea of reparative justice inside publishing houses, the emphasis will be on bringing in communities that have been historically ignored, excluded in book culture. The idea of reparative justice is specifically intended to entail forms of economic redress, which will ensure that any such initiatives are properly resourced. That brings me on to the third aspect of a reparative justice program in publishing, and that is public funding for minority-led independent presses, book festivals, bookstores, and independent media. It's those organisations that are most embedded in their communities, that understand those communities' needs and desires, that are best equipped to bring them into book culture. But those independent organisations and businesses, in the face of the kind of virtual oligopoly that is the UK publishing industry, struggle in order to get a foothold in the industry and to have the impact, whether that's economic or cultural impact, that they deserve to make. Publishing is not a level playing field. And public funding for those organisations in the name of reparative justice can lead to a more egalitarian, and I'll repeat myself, equal playing field that allows people from all kinds of backgrounds to have access and to flourish within this industry. So, to conclude, reparative justice is based on the acknowledgement of how legacies of empire continue to disadvantage and scar the experience of Black and Asian people in the UK, not least through forms of symbolic violence. In that regard, publishing plays a crucial role in helping the nation face up to and come to terms with and eventually move on from the brutality conducted in the name of empire. Reparative justice works towards a more egalitarian future to helping us work through the past. It creates a critical discourse that serves as a counterweight to race-blind language and incorporates acknowledgement of the past into present practices. It also offers, I argue, an avenue for more concrete social change, not least the fact that it's fundamentally about economic redress. But saying that, it is not just about money. The demand for reparation is about social justice, it is about reconciliation, it's about reconstructing the internal life of multicultural Britain, and in the process, eliminating institutional racism. It's in these terms that I apply a notion of reparative justice to media in creative and cultural industries. And there's something about publishing in particular that has vast amounts of potential, not least the way that books, as a powerful form of culture, can help us work through the pains of the past, which can in turn lead to heightened forms of collective flourishing. Thank you very much.